This is Pintala, a 7-part series written and performed by me, Noah Diamond. Part 1, straight outta Anatevka. Before we get started, I would like to say a few words about what this is. But it's not easy. I want to say that this is an exploration of Jewish identity and what it means to be Jewish, but I have realized, working on it, how personal this is. I've also realized that even seeing it as personal rather than handed down in stone, is already a personal take and an argument with tradition. So a lot of what follows is personal and opinionated, and I hope you'll come along for the ride, even where we may disagree. Not everyone will love everything in Part 2, God and Other Gods. And wait till we get to Part 6, Tyrants Disappearing. It's partly about Israel and Palestine, where I don't even know if I agree with myself, and partly about the rise of fascism in America right now. Well, in Part 3, A Very Brody Passover, I will take you to a Seder at the home of my great-aunt and uncle, Sarah and Joe Brody, in 1980-something. And when Uncle Joe is leading the Seder, his opening remarks are so expansive that Aunt Sarah is forced to step in and tell him to start the show already. So let's take Aunt Sarah's advice. This is Pintala. It's an exploration of my Jewish identity and what it means to me. Or, in the old Yiddish folk saying, every man has his own mishigas. Like all 10-year-old boys, I was obsessed with one thing: the Broadway musical 1776. We saw the 1972 movie version in my 5th grade history class, and I fell in love with the American Revolution. I hung a facsimile of the Declaration of Independence on my bedroom wall. I did my homework with a quill pen. I wanted so badly to be John Adams, or really I wanted to be William Daniels as John Adams in 1776. It was the drama and gravity of history that appealed to me, and all those powerful words. And we solemnly declare that we will preserve our liberties, being with one mind resolved to die free men rather than to live slaves. Thomas Jefferson on the necessity of taking up arms, 1775. Magnificent. I was overwhelmed by the still revolutionary idea that all human beings are born with the right to pursue happiness, and by the still revolutionary idea that every so often there's a musical number. But I noticed something about this 1776 world that I was so taken with. Where were the Jews? My first guess was slavery, because I knew that explained the absence of black people, and I knew it was on our resume. So were we slaves to Pharaoh and Dixie? We certainly weren't serving in Congress or participating in the debate about whether we are endowed with inalienable or unalienable rights. And at 10 years old, I felt heartbroken at this sense of not being included in the revolution. One day I was trying to express this to my mother, and I suddenly burst into tears. My mother was a little taken aback, and she said, "Are you crying because you're Jewish?" I said, "I want to be American." She said, "You are American. You're a Jewish American." Looking at this now, I can see some interesting answers I could have pursued. It's true that there were no Jewish names on our founding documents, but there were Jews in the colonies. A minority, as always. But the Truro Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island dates back to 1763. In 1790, President George Washington, not a Jew, wrote a letter to the Truro Synagogue in which he said, "Happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens." Yes, it is ironic that those words were written by an enslaver. But however flawed the man, the idea survives. 6 years later, President John Adams signed the Treaty of Tripoli, which declared to the world, "The government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion." That treaty was unanimously ratified by a Senate full of guys who had signed the Constitution. There were about 100 Jewish soldiers in Washington's Continental Army, even some officers. I could have taken an interest in that. You know, the Jews of the Revolution. I even could have written a musical about that. Red, White, and Jew. Yankee Doodle Boy Chick. But I didn't. I could have seen, as Zora Neale Hurston did, that many of the values we associate with American democracy were Jewish values first. Hurston wrote that Jewish history is much less a religious creed than a human document of struggle and growth. Jews were fighting and dying in swarms for the things in our own Bill of Rights, thousands of years before America. And so, looked at without the veil of theology, they can be said to have been the very first Americans. Where was that when I was 10 years old? I might have found solace in the undeniable fact that I didn't really want to be a statesman. What I wanted was to be in a musical about that. And my people had a lot to do with musicals, including 1776. Peter Stone, the librettist, is largely responsible for how good that show is, the only great musical that would still be great without the songs. And then there's Howard Da Silva, born Howard Silverblatt, who inhabited the role of Benjamin Franklin on Broadway and in the film. It would have made sense for me to decide at 10 years old that Howard Da Silva was my hero. But I was too hooked on the lead role of John Adams and the unforgettable delivery of William Daniels, who talked like a black Trans Am. It would be many years before I came to properly understand and admire Howard Da Silva. I have to tell you about one of my favorite photographs. On February 22nd, 1970, the Broadway company of 1776 gave a command performance at the Nixon White House. And there are White House photos of President Nixon posing with the cast. In one, Nixon and Da Silva are right next to each other, and Nixon is smiling at Da Silva, or I suppose at Benjamin Franklin, while Howard Da Silva is grinning right into the camera. He's smiling at us, like Franklin and Da Silva and you and I are in on a joke that Nixon isn't. Howard Da Silva was present at the birth of the modern American musical, having originated roles in The Cradle Will Rock and Oklahoma, also Fiorello. But his career was mangled by the Red Scare and the Blacklist. When called before the House Un-American Activities Committee, he excoriated the committee and McCarthy the way he had excoriated Mr. Mister and the Liberty Committee in The Cradle Will Rock. He was HUAC's first uncooperative witness. Nixon had been a member of the committee, although by the time of Da Silva's testimony, he was in the Senate. But every time I hear those tapes in which this disgraceful president rants psychotically against New York and Hollywood and show business and the media, all at least partly code for Jews, I think of that photo and that heavy, knowing smile on Benjamin Franklin's face. So Howard Da Silva means a lot to me now, But none of that was on my mind when I was 10. I wasn't in the market for complicated Jewish leftist heroes. What I wanted then was to be simply American. And although I don't remember crying about it on any subsequent occasion, I remained confused and disappointed by the feeling that America's story was not my story. I decided I wanted a stage name. Everyone told me Noah Diamond is already a stage name. I agreed it had a certain ring to it, but I wanted a bland American man's name because I knew that's what you did. So maybe I could be Neil Daniels. There's an American name. Neil Daniels could have signed the Declaration of Independence. Hell, Neil Daniels could have written it. And you know what a lot of people don't know about Neil Daniels, who wrote the Declaration of Independence? He's Jewish. What finally snapped me out of this was not reckoning with history or heritage, or what it means to be Jewish, or what it means to be American. No, I just got interested in another musical. My maternal grandmother was named Estelle, but everyone called her Red. Okay? Grandma Red. In 1989, when I was 12, Grandma Red took my cousin Josh and me to New York City. Grandma was born in New York and loved New York and raised our mothers in Greenwich Village. But our mothers subsequently ran off to the woods, so Josh grew up in Vermont and I in northeastern Connecticut. Going to Manhattan was like visiting our ancestral homeland. We went to the United Nations and the Empire State Building and the Stage Deli, and to the Imperial Theater to see Jerome Robbins' Broadway, the hit career omnibus of the great director-choreographer. It was a review of highlights from classics, including Fiddler on the Roof, which got to me like 1776 had. Suddenly, I was all in on Fiddler, the show, the movie, the original stories by Shalom Aleichem. I starred as Tevye in a long-running production in the living room, wearing a beard I'd made by cutting up an Alf costume.
A fiddler on the roof? Sounds crazy, no? But here in our little village of Anatevka, you might say that every one of us is a fiddler on the roof, trying to scratch out a pleasant, simple tune without breaking his neck. It isn't easy. You may ask, why do we stay up here if it's so dangerous? Well, we stay because Anatevka is our home. And how do we keep our balance? That I can tell you in one word. Tradition!
My sister Shayna played Golda, Zeitel, and Hodel. My brother Joe played Motel, Laserwolf, Perchik, Chava, and Frumacera. This may seem like a lot to ask of an 8-year-old and a 6-year-old, but I think we had a good time as long as everyone respected my vision. I think Shayna was just happy she no longer had to put on a bathing cap and play Benjamin Franklin. So here was a great Broadway musical that gave me a place in history. At the end of Fiddler, they leave for New York to start a new life. The same journey taken by Grandma Red's mother, Grandma Jenny, and at around the same time. Fiddler was the origin story I'd been looking for, and it seemed to answer my questions about why we weren't in 1776. And for the first time, I became interested in my family's story, because a great work of art had made my own identity seem exciting to me. Grandma Red's mother, Jenny Axelrod, had come from a town called Maladechna. It was in Russia at the time. After World War I, it was Poland. Now it's Belarus. History calls this the Pale of Settlement. Our grandparents called it the Old Country. And there's that Yiddish word, shtetl. But let's shtetl this once and for all. Jews lucky enough to get the hell out of Eastern Europe early in the 20th century didn't look back. The Old Country is not a term of affection. Better you shouldn't say its name. Jewish immigrants didn't love the Old Country. My mother wanted Grandma Jenny to teach her Russian, but the only Russian word Jenny was willing to share was das vidanya, goodbye. Jenny's parents were Shmuel Axelrod and Dahlia Miriam Mishnowitz. They ran an ice house where people brought their perishables to keep them cold. It was also an inn with rooms for travelers. The town was a railroad hub. The Maladechna in my mind is Anatevka from the Fiddler movie. In modern-day Maladechna, little trace of my family's village remains, not because things change with the passage of time, but because Jewish life was deliberately erased. The only major buildings still standing there that Grandma Jenny might have seen are buildings she never would have entered. You know, with steeples and crosses. In 1885, a couple of years after Jenny was born, a Polish reference book described Maladechna as a town and estate on the Usha River in the first police district of Vilna. It lies on the postal road from Vilna to Minsk. Miserably constructed, Maladechna has 1,332 inhabitants, mostly Jewish. There are 2 Orthodox churches. There are also Jewish prayer houses, a public school, a seminary, a chamber court, and a commissar for peasant affairs. Felix Zolf was a writer who grew up partly in Maladechna in the early 20th century. In his memoir, On Foreign Soil, he describes how on the eve of the holiday of Shavuot in 1915, news spread through the town that the entire Jewish population of Kovna, about 150 miles away, had been taken from their homes, stuffed into cattle cars, and deported to God knows where. Zolf writes that the Jews of Maladechna immediately abandoned the festively decorated synagogue with the candles still burning and ran straight home. There, the wagon drivers and butchers' apprentices began to harness up horse and wagon. Soon they were racing through the town, stopping at every Jewish door. Mothers and daughters with frightened faces and pounding hearts quickly snatched from their holiday tables the fresh braided challahs, the pots of meat, the dairy dishes from their pantries, and carried it all out to the wagons. Many followed behind on foot. It wasn't long before the wagons were laden with all kinds of holiday foods, and everyone hurried down to the train station. That train station is still standing. It was constructed in 1907 after Jenny left, but her parents were there and were likely among those who rushed their holiday meals to the deportees of Kovna. That tells you something about the place and the people. In that place, among those people, Shmuel and Dahlia lived and worked and had 5 boys, Isidore, Harry, Meyer, Joshua, and Philip, and 2 girls, my great-grandmother Jenny, and her big sister and best friend, Sarah Esther. Sarah Esther was good-looking and talented, according to an unpublished memoir written by her brother Meyer, The Life of the Party. Sarah Esther taught herself how to sew and converted part of the house into a clothing shop where she had several employees. Jenny would work there with Sarah Esther and learned everything from her. Meyer wrote that they were extremely close, and whatever one undertook, the other was participating. The lure of America was powerful. That was the land of opportunity, like the opportunity to not be beaten to death by the Cossacks or disappeared like the Jews of Kovna. Shmuel's brother, Uncle Meyer Cohen, had settled in New York by 1890 and was always imploring his nieces and nephews to join him, much to Shmuel and Dahlia's displeasure. Their oldest, Isidore, was the first to leave. He had his uncle send him a ticket secretly, and he waited until after the Feast of Purim to tell his parents he was leaving. His brother Meyer wrote, "We were all shocked when we heard the sobbing of our parents. They pleaded and begged him to stay. My mother was inconsolable, and my father feared that in the New World Isidore's rabbinical career would disappear. Shmuel came to believe there was a conspiracy to take his children away, and he never again communicated with his brother. Over the next decade, 3 more of his children would immigrate to the U.S., and at least one of them would admit that he was fleeing Shmuel's fanatical religious piety as much as the Tsar's anti-Semitism. Joshua was the most loyal of the Axelrod's sons. He seems to have adopted Shmuel's bitterness about the empty seats at the Sabbath table. According to Meyer, Joshua resented the fact that our siblings were leaving home for America and vowed to stay with our parents always. Even in a family never noted for its height, Joshua was exceptional for his vertical modesty. Friday was the shortest day of the week because the Sabbath began at sunset, so Joshua was known as Kurze Freitag, Short Friday. At the beginning of the 20th century, Sarah Esther died. When my older relatives would tell this story, sometimes Sarah Esther died in a fire. Sometimes it was meningitis caused by a fire, sometimes typhoid. Whatever happened, it was sudden and devastating. A terrible blow to all of us, wrote Meyer, especially Jenny. Sarah Esther's death affected her so badly that she feared any corner in the house. Our parents became worried about her well-being. When Isidore heard of what was going on, he proposed to bring her over, and our parents had to agree. It was the summer of 1905 when Jenny Axelrod stepped off the SS Campania and into New York City. The idea was to take some time off, visit family, and recover from the tragedy of Sarah Esther's death. But she never did recover, and she never went back to Maladechna. My mother remembers that when she would ask Grandma Jenny about her early life, Jenny would begin to respond, then arrive at the subject of her sister Sarah Esther and cry, unable to continue. That was one reason Jenny never returned to the old country. Relative safety and security was probably another. But years later, she told her younger daughter, Grandma Red, that almost as soon as she arrived, she knew she was going to stay forever because she had fallen so deeply in love with one particular aspect of American city life. She said she was seduced by a toilet. The word shtetl refers to the Ashkenazi communities of Eastern Europe before World War II. These began as business arrangements between Polish noblemen and poor Jewish farmers and tradesmen. But by the middle of the 19th century, you could go years without seeing a Polish nobleman, and the shtetls became market towns controlled by landowners and officials. Catherine II established the Pale of Settlement, restricting Russia's Jewish population to 25 former Polish provinces. Jews in the Pale of Settlement had no political power. They were forbidden to own land or to travel beyond the Pale. They mostly lived in squalor, and they were forever subject to the cruelty of the Cossacks. It was a life of constant fear that meant being abused, terrorized, and killed. And that was just by the police. And yet, there were shtetls in Eastern Europe as early as the 16th century, and as late as the beginning of World War II. This was home for generations. And it was a vibrant culture. They had Yiddish, a beautiful, colorful, musical language. They had a literary scene, sometimes a free press. and a religious practice, which was part of almost everything they did. And with the Jewish knack for finding joy and meaning even in lamentable circumstances, they lived full lives. And shtetl life was remembered with a rosy glow, especially by people who weren't there. In the decades following the Holocaust, this shtetl nostalgia sets in as if to say, we were here before the Nazis, and we're still here after the Nazis. It's in that environment that a Broadway musical becomes the most romantic vision of the shtetl ever conceived. In the theater, Anatevka is a Marc Chagall painting, handcrafted in dirty colors and thrumming with this perfect, happy, sad music. I do love the movie, too, but I wonder if I would have felt quite so represented by Fiddler if I had seen the movie first. That is a rougher and more primitive Anatevka. We really see how hard Tevye is working and how difficult life is. We see pogrom violence, and we notice that the people of the shtetl, by definition, are not big city types. These are Jews who milk cows and slaughter chickens and get water from the river. On stage, they seem a lot more like New Yorkers. My first Tevye, by the way, was Jason Alexander, the star of Jerome Robbins' Broadway. Later on Seinfeld, he would play a version of the persona perfected by Woody Allen, eventually morphing into Larry David. Seinfeld drew from the wellspring of 20th century Jewish American comedy, and it's interesting how little Tevye has to do with any of that. Tevye is not much like Woody or Groucho or any of my comedy heroes, even though the role was played by Zero Mostel and had been offered to Danny Kaye. Comedy heroes with one foot in the Borscht Belt. That's why Norman Jewison, when he directed the movie Fiddler, was determined not to cast Zero Mostel. As played on film by the Israeli actor Chaim Topol, Tevye is not a nebbish or a wise guy. He's not stupid, nor is he especially smart. Often he's foolish, full of misquotations and faulty logic. He's a burly, salt-of-the-earth figure, a battered worker, enduring constant agony in order to feed his family. He fantasizes about being wealthy, but the extravagance he dreams of is only a slight upgrade. He'd have more chickens and spend more time in temple. His wife Golda would still be in the kitchen all day, but she'd have more help. This is a small world, and Topol's performance, filmed on location in what was then Yugoslavia, makes it literal. In 1966, when he was not yet 40, Topol premiered as Tevye in the Israeli production of Fiddler. Jerome Robbins and the producer Hal Prince were impressed with him and cast him in the London production. Robbins even redirected the show around him. Topol had to learn the English version phonetically, which he did by listening to the Broadway cast recording and working with a British acting teacher. The resulting salad of dialects might as well be the sound of a 19th century Russian Jew. It must have meant a lot that Robbins championed Topol in the role, considering his adamant support of Zero Mostel on Broadway. The guys who wrote Fiddler had someone else in mind. The book writer Joseph Stein and the songwriters Jerry Bach and Sheldon Harnick went to Robbins with their unanimous pick to play Tevye. Robbins said, "Oh yes, he would be wonderful. I'm a big fan, but I've got another idea." So who was that top choice for Tevye in the eyes of the writers? Well, it was an actor seemingly born to play the role. A musical theater star whose vast resume included the 1953 off-Broadway hit The World of Shalom Aleichem. He had also recorded Shalom Aleichem stories for Columbia Masterworks. And in 1960, he'd released an LP, An Evening with Shalom Aleichem, and appeared on the cover dressed like Tevye and playing the fiddle. Obviously, this was meant to be. If you want to think about it before I tell you, hit pause now. It was Howard Da Silva. Anyway, during my pre-adolescent Fiddler mania, although I was profoundly affected by Topol's performance, Zero was more my kind of guy. At the same time I was learning about Fiddler, there was a funny thing happened on the way to the Forum. Its opening number thrillingly recreated in Jerome Robbins' Broadway with Jason Alexander as Pseudolus. Forum took place in ancient Rome, and it was based on the comedies of Plautus, but it seemed almost as Jewish as Fiddler because of the way it's written and played. That could have been a clue that the thing I cared about had more to do with the theater than the temple. But then at the top of Forum, Pseudolus announces that the theater is a temple, and Fiddler on the Roof had made me want to be Jewish in the same way that 1776 had made me want to be American. And I figured American is a nationality, Jewish is a religion, and so I decided to be religious. I didn't realize how rare and lucky it was that this was even my decision to make. My parents always allowed us to make our own religious decisions. It wasn't a religious upbringing, but we understood ourselves to be Jewish, and we celebrated or observed the major holidays, often in the company of relatives who were more religious than we were. Years after she fell in love with a toilet, my great-grandmother Jenny fell in love with a tailor named Simon Ragavin. Simon had come from Volozhin, 25 miles from Molodechna. By the time Jenny married Simon in Manhattan in 1917, she was well into her 30s and had been in the United States for 12 years. Her brother Meyer wrote that because of her ongoing grief over the death of Sarah Esther, Jenny kept working hard for many hours with little consideration for settling down. She kept herself relentlessly busy as a garment worker and as an activist for women's suffrage and the blossoming labor movement. It's no surprise that Jenny and Simon both worked in the rag trade, but to Jenny, this field, common to Jewish immigrants, must have been a daily reminder of the sister who taught her how to sew and opened a clothing shop in the house. Despite the grief that was never far from the surface, Jenny clearly wanted to be reminded of Sarah Esther because she and Simon had 2 daughters, and she named them Sarah and Esther. My great-aunt Sarah was born in 1918. In 1921, when Jenny tried to name her second daughter Esther, someone talked her into Estelle. But Estelle would always be known as Red. Sarah and Red, sisters and best friends, named for Sarah Esther Axelrod, who put the stars in the shtetl sky. Sarah and Red stood like redwoods over our childhoods and seemed to represent 2 distinct practices: cultural Jewishness, Red, and religious Judaism, Sarah. Apparently 'twas always thus. Sarah's deep religious feelings were her own. Simon was a member of Workmen's Circle, a fraternal organization which encouraged a light form of Judaism and emphasized assimilation. When Sarah was a little girl, she would take the long walk from home in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, to a synagogue in Williamsburg to attend services and Hebrew school completely on her own. Meanwhile, under the same roof, her little sister Red was a born skeptic, unimpressed with spiritual ideas, but powerfully drawn to activism and social justice. In her autograph book from PS 190 in Brooklyn, a 14-year-old Red wrote that her favorite subject was history, favorite author Maxim Gorky, favorite song The Internationale, that her hero was Lenin, and that she wanted to be a lawyer or a swimmer. It was 1935. Evidence of the failure of capitalism was everywhere. Americans were starving to death, and revolutionary fervor had taken hold among the students at PS 190. One page of the autograph book has pictures of ball players and a place to record the class cheer. Instead, Red wrote, "When the revolution comes, there won't be any arithmetic. When the revolution comes." Notes from classmates make frequent reference to the new and better world that's right around the corner. A girl named Naomi says, "Fight!" One Betty writes, "May your life be as bright as the light in Red Square." Hannah says, "God," and God is in quotes to indicate that there is no God, "God certainly knew what he was doing when he made your head red." I remember talking to Red about God once. She said, "I believe in nothin', love, nothin' at all, except for your beautiful face." And she gave me one of those Grandma Red kisses on the cheek that were so forceful they were almost bites. Meanwhile, back in the old country, the world Red and Sarah's mother, Jenny, had left behind was in a state of flux. Her youngest brother, Philip, had been in the United States since 1913, leaving only Meyer and the ever-faithful Joshua, or Kurtzefretik. Meyer had married a cousin, Sonia Mishnowitz, and had 2 daughters, Dina and Sarah, named in memory of Sarah Esther. Joshua married a woman named Rachel Spector. Their eldest was born in 1921, the same year as Grandma Red, and they named her Esther. In the summer of 1924, as Meyer and Sonia were welcoming their 3rd child and first son, Shmuel Axelrod died. Meyer and Sonia named their son Shmuel, or Sam. 6 weeks after the death of her husband Shmuel, Dahlia died. Jenny had not seen them in almost 2 decades. But Kurtzefretik was still staying put. He and Rachel had had some success operating a bakery and then a fabric store. Soon, like Tevye and Golda, they had 5 daughters: Esther, Sonia, Dina, Miriam, and Hannah. And so there they were, trying to scratch out a pleasant, simple tune against a backdrop of increasing menace. The exodus of European Jews to the United States had dropped dramatically with the passage of the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act, signed into law by President Calvin Coolidge in the summer of 1924. Meyer had visited the U.S. in 22 and could have stayed, but he had another idea. By 1925, he had gone to tremendous effort to move his family to the still rustic city of Tel Aviv. And now, as Isidore had once pressured his siblings to come to America, Meyer began imploring Joshua to send his children to Palestine, specifically his eldest, Esther. Joshua's daughter, Esther, has been described in much the same way as his sister, Sarah Esther. Beautiful and brilliant, kind and decent, something of a light source. Sam Axelrod, Meyer's son and Esther's cousin, would write in his own memoir that Esther was vivacious, life-loving, talented, and devoid of hatred toward anybody in the world. She was a particularly advanced Hebrew student and would benefit from the more advanced Hebrew schooling available in Palestine. In 1933, at the age of 13, Esther Axelrod arrived in the port of Jaffa. Esther and her 3 cousins, Dina, Sarah, and Sam, were instantly close. And Sam would later write that Esther made friends everywhere. In a matter of months, it was hard for me to believe that she was not my sister, that I had known her for only a short time. She excelled in school. One day, the teacher announced that Esther was the outstanding student of the year. Everybody applauded. My cousin lifted her head from the hidden Polish detective story she was reading under the desk. She asked the girl next to her, "What's the applause for?" So Esther Axelrod was right at home in Tel Aviv. Surprisingly, the other Esther, Estelle Red Ragavin, and her sister Sarah, and their parents, Jenny and Simon, were not quite so comfortable in Greenpoint, Brooklyn. Aunt Sarah recalled that there were very few Jewish families in the area, And one reason Simon preferred that Sarah not make that long trip to synagogue was the anti-Semitic neighborhood she'd walk through. Sarah remembered being beaten up by other kids who would scream, "Christ killer." It made life in Greenpoint so unpleasant that Sarah and Red took it upon themselves to find the family another place to live. The two girls set out on foot and knocked on doors until they found an apartment in the friendlier neighborhood of East New York, Brooklyn. Sarah and Red attended PS 190 and then Thomas Jefferson High School, a massive facility recently constructed on Pennsylvania Avenue. They entered it every morning between Roman columns, framed by the words, literally etched in stone, "Let reverence for the laws become the political religion of the nation." Abraham Lincoln. Sarah graduated in 1935. In her yearbook photo, she looks pretty but indifferent. Messy hair, head cocked to the side, glasses, and the same pensive, worried smile I would know 50 years later. The yearbook tells us that Sarah was a member of the Hebrew Club and the Current Events Club, and offers this description of her character. "A serious trend tints her every move." Red does not appear in the Jefferson yearbook 3 years later because she did not graduate. During her senior year, there was a teacher's strike. Red, with a passion for workers' rights that must have made Jenny proud, cut class to join the picket line. A conservative teacher who opposed the strike refused to grant the passing grade Red needed to graduate. I'm sure Red said something like, "Fine then, I won't graduate." She got her equivalency diploma later and a degree in education from New York University. Sarah went from high school to nursing school at the Cumberland Hospital School of Nursing in Brooklyn and Bellevue Hospital in Manhattan. Sarah loved medicine and remembered this as among the most exciting times of her life. She graduated in 1939 and was quickly hired by Manhattan's Governor Hospital. While Sarah Raghavan was starting her professional career in Manhattan, and Estelle Red Raghavan was marching on the picket line instead of across the stage to accept a diploma, Esther Axelrod was entering her 6th year in Tel Aviv. Esther completed secondary school, having added English to her list of languages, and decided to stay, taking a job in Meyer's office. Sam Axelrod remembered Esther as an entertainer, an avid reader who would tell her cousins about the books she'd read, acting out the characters and stories. "She was like my third sister," Sam wrote. "She was closest to me in age and shared many of her experiences with me. But as Esther grew up into her teens, she and my sister Sarah became inseparable. Since all three of us slept in the same room, I would hear them whispering about every boy they met. I have a photograph that belonged to Grandma Red, showing Sarah Axelrod and Esther Axelrod together in Tel Aviv in the late 1930s. Sarah is in her early 20s, Esther in her late teens. They're in similar outfits, making use of the same patterned fabric. The sun is in their eyes, and Sarah Axelrod squints at the camera with a slight smile. Esther's head is tilted downward, and she's grinning, as though the photographer, possibly Sam, has caught her on the edge of laughter. The two cousins look like sisters and best friends. So here we have Sarah and Esther in Tel Aviv, and Sarah and Estelle in New York, all named for the girl whose life ended too soon, decades ago, in Maladechna. In Maladechna, Esther's 4 sisters and their parents, Rachel and Joshua, kept on. The fabric store was doing well, but it had been 6 years since Esther left for Tel Aviv, and at this point they insisted that she come home, at least for a visit. Esther must have been reluctant because they wrote to Meyer and Sonia too, begging them to send her. Esther left for Malodechna in what was now Poland in the summer of 1939 and was reunited with her family. On August 23rd, Hitler and Stalin signed their non-aggression pact. A week later, Germany invaded Poland from the west. 17 days after that, the Soviets invaded from the east and occupied Malodechna. Esther found work with the Soviet Bank. From the letters she sent to Tel Aviv, Cousin Sam thought she seemed resigned to the closed-door policy of the communist regime, which would not allow her to ever return to Palestine. Kurtzer Freitag probably felt relieved. His family was together, and between the Nazis and the communists, you'd take the communists. It must have felt like the arrival of a delicate peace. Really, it was the start of the Second World War. In the summer of 1941, to the surprise of nobody, Hitler violated the pact and invaded the Soviet Union with the goals of annexing territory, eradicating communism, and killing Jewish people. The German Wehrmacht entered Malodechna in June and established Stalag 342, a POW camp for Soviet enlisted personnel. There were certainly some Jewish people among them, but the Jews of Malodechna went about their lives, now confined to designated ghetto streets and forced to wear yellow stars, with the threat of brutality and annihilation more terrible than ever, and escape impossible. While the first prisoners were being taken to the gas chambers at Auschwitz, the Jews of Malodechna and other towns like it were being rounded up in groups of 50 or 100 or 1,000, taken away and never seen again. Joshua Kurtzer Freitag Axelrod and Rachel Spector and their daughters Chana, Dina, Miriam, Sonia, and Esther were among the approximately 600 people who were rounded up at gunpoint one day and taken to the edge of the forest north of the town beyond the Usha River. The men were forced to dig an enormous grave, and then everyone was herded into it and shot. Many were still alive when the Nazis buried them. Decades later, Sam Axelrod would meet an eyewitness to this massacre who explained that non-Jewish residents of the town had been forced to watch. An eyewitness to a similar mass killing in Minsk testified that Nazi soldiers began first to hurl the children and suckling infants torn from their mothers' arms into the grave. Women were pushed in on top of the children. Next came the men. The German soldiers then opened fire from machine guns at this helpless human mass, which continued to sway and sigh in the agonies of death. The sun was already setting when the shooting ceased. The Nazis covered the grave with a thin layer of sand, which moved and palpitated for some hours. Another eyewitness to another mass killing in another Polish town noticed that for some time after the burial, blood oozed up from the soil as though the earth itself was bleeding. Their task accomplished, the Nazis hung a sign at the Malodechna railroad station. "There are no Jews here. This town is clean." The murders of my cousins were part of a fascist killing spree that engulfed Poland after the invasion. In May of 1942, 80 miles away in Vilna, 60,000 Jews were murdered over the course of 2 weeks. In August, 50 miles away in Minsk, 35,000 were killed in a single day. In December, the Inter-Allied Information Committee declared that Germany had transformed Poland into one vast center for murdering Jews. A London newspaper reported that Poland is now a mass grave. It would be some time before Sam Axelrod would learn what had happened to his uncle and aunt and cousins, and even longer before he was able to believe it. For years, he wrote, "I could not accept that Esther had suffered such a tragic end, and the world had returned to its own agenda as if she had never existed. In New York City, Jenny and Simon and Sarah and Red had horrified eyes on Europe. They remained unaware of what had happened to Jenny's brother and his family. But Sarah Raghavan, 23 years old, knew enough to leave the nursing staff at Governor Hospital on the east side of Manhattan and volunteer for the U.S. Army to bring her skills as a medical professional to the American effort to destroy fascism. "I felt it was my duty," she said many years later, "even though I wasn't exactly the happiest person to go into the army." She served as a nurse lieutenant in General Patton's Third Army from 1942 to 45. After she was inducted at Fort Dix in New Jersey, Sarah's military service would take her first across the country to Walla Walla and Spokane and Seattle, then back east and across the Atlantic to Belfast and Blackpool, and a series of towns in France and Germany. In Metz, France, she was in a car accident, miraculously unscathed, but she missed the rededication of the Metz synagogue, which had been used as a barn and a brothel during the Nazi occupation. In Luxembourg, she met the novelist and journalist Meyer Levin, who disturbed her with stories of French Catholic nuns who had provided shelter to Jewish children and then refused to reunite them with their families. They felt they had saved them from the Nazis, and now they were going to save them from Judaism. In the recently liberated camp at Buchenwald, she saw the gallows that had been used for public hangings, and she saw the ovens, and picked up some ashes and held them in her hand. On leave in Brussels, she was directed to a club where she met members of the Jewish Brigade, a British army unit consisting of 5,000 Jewish soldiers from Palestine. Sarah met the celebrated chaplain, Rabbi Bernard Moses Kasper. His family was from Kovna, the shtetl whose deportees, the Jews of Malodechna, had tried to help on Shavuot in 1915. The next day, she accompanied Rabbi Kasper to a gathering of the brigade in an airplane hangar in Antwerp. When they entered, the revered rabbi and a young woman in an American Army uniform, the entire hangar fell silent. And in this silence, among the sea of faces, there was a familiar one. All at once, he and Sarah were walking toward each other and tearfully embracing. They only knew one another from photographs and letters, but this was unmistakably cousin Sam Axelrod. It was during this visit in Antwerp that Sam told Sarah the terrible news he had learned from an officer from Gorodok, a village less than 20 miles from Malodechna. Sure enough, this officer was well aware of the girl from Malodechna who had spent several years in Palestine. This was big news, and Esther's tales of life in the Holy Land had been circulating since her return. Sarah knew Esther as she knew Sam from years of letters and photographs. Sarah wept when Sam told her the news, and when she talked about it decades later. And she had to tell Jenny, and she had to tell Red. Sarah would later say that she had never felt strongly about Zionism until that talk with Rabbi Kasper in Brussels. But it was the day after that she learned what had happened in Malodechna. This too would have informed her gathering sense that Jewish people needed a country of their own. If Kurtzer Freitag and his wife had tried to take their family to the United States, they would have been turned away. Millions of people were desperately pounding on the Golden Door while fascism devoured Europe, and American conservatives seized power by exploiting anti-immigrant and anti-Semitic sentiment. Nazi collaborators like the America First Committee advanced the notion that immigrants were dangerous, and that Jewish immigrants constituted a particular threat to economic stability and racial purity. Meyer Axelrod's visit in 1922 was apparently the last time a member of my family traveled from Maladechna to the United States until 1997, when Meyer's son, Sam Axelrod, returned from a visit to the town of his father's birth and his cousin's death. There he saw the modest concrete pillar which marks the site of the mass grave, at the edge of the forest, north of the town, beyond the Usha River. It's still there, in a spot that appears in photographs to be bizarrely peaceful. From Aunt Sarah and Grandma Red, we would all hear Esther's story in various forms, sometimes scrambled in the retelling. But the story hung in the air, its flexibility a testament to its unthinkable trauma. They were shot into their graves. Grandma would hold your gaze for a moment to make sure you were getting the horror of it. It was the second great tragedy you were likely to hear about if you asked Red or Sarah about the family history. The first being the death of Sarah Esther, 40 years earlier, in another world. I am 12 years old, and I am standing on West 45th Street between 8th Avenue and Schubert Alley. Although in years to come I will live and work mere blocks from here, right now I am a kid who moved 2 years ago from the woods to the suburbs of northern Connecticut, and I have just stepped out of one sensory overload inside the Imperial Theater and into another one outside the Imperial Theater. It is 1989, and I am overwhelmed. My cousin Josh and I are gripping our playbills, and Grandma Red is hailing a taxi.
Taxi!
And we are piling into it. In 3 hours, we have experienced a significant slice of the history of musical theater, capping off a day that has taken us through centuries of creative achievement at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and 1,050 feet into the sky at the Empire State Building, where we saw Ashrita Furman break the world record for juggling on a pogo stick. My feet have that beautiful New York pain, and my fingers still smell like the pickles at the stage deli, and my head is pounding with tradition. It's after midnight when we arrive at the home of Grandma's friend Myrna in Queens. Myrna greets us at the door in her nightgown, friendly and welcoming, but obviously it's late and she was sleeping. Myrna politely asks if we'd like anything to eat or drink, and my cousin Josh says, "I'll have a hot pastrami sandwich." That night in Myrna's guest room in Queens, I find it impossible to sleep. Instead, I wander the room, I look out the window, I write and draw in my notebook. This is the first heart-pounding, head-swimming, sleepless New York night of my life, and I am already good at it. All of a sudden, the fact that I was Jewish seemed really interesting, but I had no idea what any of it meant. I knew we had gone from being the only Jewish family in Willington, Connecticut, to one of many in Windsor, Connecticut. But I remember a conversation in which my father said, "There are a lot of Christians in the world." And I said, "And there are a lot of Jews," like I was finishing his sentence with what was obviously the next point. And he said, "Well, no. Compared to the number of Christians, no." So after Red introduced me to a Broadway musical that got me interested in Judaism, I turned to Sarah for religious guidance. But not only Sarah. By the time I came along, my great-aunt, this brave World War II medical officer, a participant in world history, was an energetic, elderly woman who lived in a beige house on Brewer Drive in Bloomfield, Connecticut, with her counterpart, the other religious influence on my early life. After the war, Sarah had married an old friend from high school named Joseph Brody. He too had been born to immigrants from the Pale of Settlement, and he too had served in the war, though not in Europe, in the Pacific. I think he made the biggest impression on me simply by being an old man. I didn't know many old men when I was a kid. I was not lucky enough to know either of my grandfathers. Grandma Red met Joseph Lerner at a meeting of the Young Communists League in Brooklyn in the late 1930s. Red and Joe would grow disenchanted with communism, but not with each other. They married in 1942, and within a decade had welcomed my Aunt Kathy, Uncle Fred, and my mother, Cindy. Joe Lerner was a poet and philosopher, a legal transcriber, and an opera and literature fanatic, and he was wise and funny, and we would have loved each other. Around the time Jenny and her brothers were coming to America, a similar crossing was made by Shmulek Demanis and his family from Baranovka. Soon after his arrival, Shmulek Demanis became Sam Diamond. His son was my grandfather, Norman, for whom I was named. Norman married Bernice Pomerantz, known as Bunny, and had 2 sons, my father, Steve, and my uncle Rick. Norm Diamond was an engineer and a mathematician, a teacher and a firefighter, and he was wise and funny, and we would have loved each other. But Grandpa Norm died suddenly at a dance at the age of 38, 16 years before I was born. And Grandpa Joe died of leukemia 10 years later. By the time I came along, that generation of men in my family was represented by Joe Brody. He was hard of hearing, and he had a brittle, roaring voice. Hey, Noah! Although he'd grown up in New York City like everyone else, Joe Brody didn't have the classic New York accent of Sarah and Red. He had a strange, stentorian way of speaking. He had gone to Tulane University in New Orleans, and sometimes his delivery was attributed to a Southern influence. But I think he sounded rabbinical. These were the ponderous rhythms of an old rabbi. And Uncle Joe was our family's religious patriarch. He was a lot closer to Topol's Tevye than to any comedian. Like Tevye, Joe was rugged and gruff and prideful. Not intellectual, but pretentious. He couldn't stand the way Jewish people were depicted in a lot of comedy, and he once angrily denounced Woody Allen to me before I even knew who Woody Allen was. First of all, the man is a self-hating Jew. Many years later, in Deconstructing Harry, when a character voices that exact criticism, the man himself replies for the ages, I may hate myself, but not because I'm Jewish. To me, Joe Brody was always elderly. He was already in his 60s when I was born, and he and Sarah had raised 3 boys, my mother's first cousins. I found Uncle Joe fascinating and funny, also a little frightening. He was difficult to communicate with. He loved to talk. He was an avid pontificator, but listening was not his thing. You really had to yell for him to hear you, with the result that he could express nuance, but you had to boil everything down to brief, yellable phrases. Seeing the leaves turn, we observe the passage of time, how everything green must turn, and how after the winter it will be green again, and the cycle continues. Yeah, it's really getting dark early these days. What? It's getting dark earlier. I can't hear you. Dark early. What? Early for what? Here comes Aunt Sarah to help. Joe, he's saying it's getting dark earlier these days. What? Dark, Joe! It's dark! Well, that's all right. I always regarded Uncle Joe as a very wise man. He certainly wanted to be seen that way, but there were occasional holes in that image. I vividly remember his instructions about what to do if you see a snake. 1, get a hammer. And 2, hit the snake with the hammer. When I repeated this to my mother, she suggested that I run all of Uncle Joe's advice past her from now on.
Sie seien akkurat geworden, 40 Jahre, als sie leben sich in einem dus altitschke Pur. Sie haben sich geältert, so wie sie, 80 und 70 sie. Gott hat sie mit...
Through Sarah and Joe, we could experience Judaism. At the Brody's house, you wore a yarmulke on Friday nights if you were a boy, but they let the girls wear them too if they wanted to. They weren't monsters. We prayed in Hebrew and went to synagogue and obliged Uncle Joe through loud, barking dialogues about whatever was on his mind. When I was 14 years old, I made a list in my notebook of his favorite words and phrases. Managing. That's how he would ask how you are. He wouldn't say, how are you? He'd say, are you managing? Equipment. Oh boy, look at all this equipment. Do you have all your equipment? Easy. 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 Are you managing? Sarah's favorite words and phrases? Nice. Very nice. Barley. Barley. In addition to all the other remarkable things about Sarah, she was way out in front on nutrition. And besides a mastery of Jewish cuisine, she was interested in macrobiotic cooking and was always talking about barley or millet or something. She was always confronting you with a spoonful of something, with the promise that it was very nice. I loved Sarah and Joe, and I thought some of the Jewish stuff was very nice. But Grandma Red was my Pied Piper of theater and museums. Her home was devoid of embroidered challah covers or stacks of wine-soaked Haggadahs, but was full of art from around the world, beautiful old books, and stacks of The New Yorker. Red was always there for Sarah, arrived days early to help cook for Passover, but maintained an air of bored tolerance during the Seder. But if Grandma didn't want me to give God a chance, she shouldn't have taken me to Broadway. Fiddler on the Roof had awakened all these Jewish feelings, and I started looking forward to the holidays more, to visiting the Brodies and being steeped in matzo ball soup and grape juice. I learned the prayers, I lit the candles, I earnestly sought the beauty and meaning that so many people seem to find in religious practice. I tried to think about God the way Sarah and Joe thought about God. I still had the Declaration of Independence on my bedroom wall, but now I also had a mezuzah on my bedroom door. I was reading about Jewish history, attempting to reckon with the Holocaust. Art Spiegelman's Mouse was new and became a touchstone. I read Anne Frank and Elie Wiesel, Primo Levi and Viktor Frankl. I peppered my vocabulary with Yiddish. Though I never came close to learning the language, I had all my schleps and kvetches and phrases I picked up from Leo Roston. Abi gesinnt, as long as you're healthy. Abi gesinnt, ken men glücklich sein. As long as you're healthy, you can be happy. And this mystical expression, das Pintele Yid, referring to the little Jewish spark inside us. I told my parents I wanted to go to Hebrew school, and I did, 3 days a week at a synagogue, and my sister Shana and my brother Joe followed, and they stuck with it and had their bat and bar mitzvahs. I was very proud of them, but I didn't last more than a year in Hebrew school. I realized that whatever mattered to me about being Jewish didn't have a lot to do with the religious practice of Judaism. That still left everything unanswered. It wasn't the thing I wanted to understand and feel closer to. My confusion and curiosity about what this means was simply not addressed by ritualistic incantations in a strange language or endless rules about food. And then there's God. We're going to save the subject of God for next time, but I'll tell you right now, he won't be making an appearance. The point is that faith and tradition are not immutable characteristics. The religious practice of Judaism is a learned behavior and a choice available to everyone. But being Jewish is also an inherited trait. The religious practice of Judaism was not what the Cossacks or the Nazis were trying to eradicate. It was not the reason my cousin Esther and her family were murdered in Malodechna. And it's not what gave me the feeling at 10 years old that I was not in 1776, but I was in Fiddler on the Roof. Which means that when I talk about being Jewish, I must be talking about race.
Do or die. A real life nephew of mine uncle Sim, born on the 4th of July. I've got a Yankee Doodle sweetheart. Oh, he's mine Yankee Doodle joy. Yankee Doodle went to London just to ride a pony. I am a Yankee Doodle boy. Leben soll Columbus, trink Brüder, lach l'chaim. Leben soll Columbus, vor dem Land im Neuen. Seid zufrieden, gläub nicht in die Trombus. Schrei jeden, Leben soll Columbus. Is Amerika am Mechaich leben. Es gut auf jede Schreine, Lämmi sollen also leben. Willkommen ist Bixen, Menschenblit darf mir auf Zures. A Gubernator darf mir nicht, a Kaiser auf Kapuris. Es ist geht, sing ich alle mit. Oi, leben soll Columbus, trink Brüder, lach l'chaim. Christopher Columbus war dem Land im Neuen. Seid zufrieden, gläub nicht in der Trombis. Schreit jeden, Leben soll Columbus. Yankee Doodle fällt uptown, reit auf a Pferdl. Geht rein im Barbershop und schert sich auf das Pferdl. I am that Yankee Doodle boy.
Thanks for listening to part 1 of Pintala, a 7-part series. The beautiful music you've just heard was Yankee Doodle Boy Lebensal Columbus, a medley performed by Eleanor Risa from her 1992 album Going Home, Gems of Yiddish Song. I thank Ms. Risa for permission to play it for you here. Learn more at eleanorrisa.com. Lebensal Columbus is a Boris Tomaszewski song from the 1915 Yiddish musical The New Millionaire. It's a parody of immigrant enthusiasm for America, and it's more ironic for more reasons than ever. Other music heard in this episode includes Palestina by J. Russell Robinson and Con Conrad, performed by the original Dixieland Jazz Band, Broken Life by the Russian Novelty Orchestra, Mein Städtele Bells, performed by the Berries and by Sammy Wardell and his Paramuse Recorders, Mazel Tov by Emil Stern, Lebensal Columbus, performed by Abraham Rosenstein, Internationale, recorded by the Kunstler Orchestra, Kaddish by cantor Alberto Meyer Pincus, and Golden Wedding, with that refrain, 80 und 70 sie, meaning he's 80 and she's 70, performed by Rita Marlowe with Sid Phillips and his orchestra. You also heard The President's March by Greg Wardson, Broadway Bigwig by Art and Robin Munson, Klezmer Moon by Cynthia Anastasia LaFata, Broadway in Blue by Eamon Watt, Mitzvah River by Paul Gelsomine, Lament for Jerusalem by David Hollinsworth, Making It on Broadway by Benjamin Orth, Shalom Alechem Rhapsodies by David Ezra Okensar, and Brookline Chairlift and this version of Hava Nagila by Steve Rice, licensed from the Pond 5 Media Collection. Sources for impressions of shtetl life include On Foreign Soil by Felix Zolf and Life is with People by Mark Ziborowski and Elizabeth Herzog. For an excellent cultural history of Fiddler on the Roof, see Wonder of Wonders by Alyssa Solomon. Zora Neale Hurston is quoted by Louis Menand in The New Yorker, January 13th, 2025. Meyer Axelrod is quoted from his unpublished memoir. Sam Axelrod is quoted from his book, The Wolf and the Lamb. Special thanks to my cousin Michael Axelrod for further help with this material. Notes and links to these and other resources, and a comments thread where you can express your opinion about this episode, can be found at noahdiamond.com/Pintala.